Hi, I'm John Hood. I'm the author of a new novel called Mountain Folk. My book is called Historical Fantasy. That means it's a bit of a mashup of historical fiction and fantasy fiction. In the case of Mountain Folk, readers will see George Washington commanding his troops at Yorktown and the Over Mountain men marching, well, over the mountains to defeat the Tories at Kings Mountain. You'll see Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton argue about banking reform, abolitionism, and pretty much everything else. You'll meet American Indian leaders such as Cornstalk, Shenandoah, Dragging Canoe, and Nancy Ward. And you'll watch famous frontiersman Daniel Boone fight a giant fire-spitting salamander. Yep, it's that kind of book. But several of Mountain Folk's central characters aren't famous Americans at all. They're fairies. Now, when I say fairies, don't think of little Tinkerbells with gossamer wings. I'm using the word more broadly to describe all sort of wee folk, such as dwarves, elves, brownies, and pixies. It turns out that almost all cultures around the world have stories of wee folk. Accounts vary, of course, but a surprising number of them converge in key details. Many are creatures that stand 2 to 3 feet tall. They're invisible to most humans, if they want to be. They're infused with magic, attuned to nature, and prone to pranks, but are also willing to trade favors for something they covet. Some fairy folk, such as sylphs, have wings. Others prefer to live in the water. They have gills and scaly skin. I happen to be standing in Chatham County, North Carolina, just upriver of the place where the Deep River and the Haw River come together to form the Cape Fear River, which then flows all the way down to Wilmington. Just behind me, just a bit down the river, is a place called Mermaid Point. Just before the Revolutionary War, one of the locals built a tavern near here. The story goes that at night, when the customers would stumble home from the tavern, they'd sometimes see mermaids at the convergence of the Haw and Deep Rivers on a sandbar that's now submerged. Fairy-type beings were also common in the folklore of Native American cultures. Among the Cherokee, who play a key role in mountain folk, their elders told stories about the Nunnehi, the Yunwi Junsti, and several other spirit folk. Some of them lived on high peaks, such as Blood Mountain in Georgia. Others lived in forests or underneath rivers. The Catawba Indians of the Carolinas had their own tales of fairies. They called them Yehasuri, which just means wild people. In the world of mountain folk, these old legends about fairy folk turn out to be true, or at least garbled versions of the truth. I had a lot of fun researching the folklore of various cultures and then assembling them as part of a broader story about colonial America. Now, I should say that first and foremost, Mountain Folk is an adventure story. There are brave heroes and terrifying monsters, thrilling rescues, and epic battles. But I also explore some serious themes. The immigrant experience, the clash of cultures, and the temptations of power. I also explore in Mountain Folk what it means to be loyal once distant wars come home, once brothers start fighting brothers. Much of the action of Mountain Folk occurs, you guessed it, on or around mountains. I'm actually talking to you from one of the key settings of the novel, what is now Hanging Rock State Park in Stokes County, North Carolina. You can see Hanging Rock there right behind me. In fact, the very first scene of the novel occurs just a short distance from where I'm standing. A 16-year-old Daniel Boone and his family are on their way south from their original home in Pennsylvania to their new home on the Yadkin River. Daniel picks up his trusty rifle and goes bear hunting on the mountain. He finds a bear, all right, and a whole lot more. Daniel befriends the first fantasy character in the story at this point, a winged fairy named Gorin, and the two end up facing a monstrous cat that bears a certain resemblance to a famous creature from North Carolina folklore. Here's another key location, a region on Virginia's Shenandoah River called Fort Valley. George Washington enjoyed hunting in this region, which is one reason why part of it is now called the George Washington National Forest. I'll mention two other peaks that play a role in the story too. One of them is Blood Mountain. Has a nice epic fantasy ring, doesn't it? Blood Mountain is one of Georgia's tallest peaks. In Cherokee folklore, it was one of the homes of a spirit folk known as the Nunnehi. Another important setting for mountain folk, though it's really more of a high plateau than a peak, is called Kings Mountain. Located right on the North Carolina-South Carolina line, it was the site of a key Revolutionary War battle that helped put an end to Britain's attempts to subjugate the southern colonies. I'm just giving you a few examples here. There are many other mountains featured in the action of mountain folk, including a peak thousands of miles away in Europe where a group of squabbling lords are meeting to decide whether to plant a colony in America. So why did I name my first novel Mountain Folk? Well, among other things, this book is an epic fantasy. Many of the most famous works in that genre, such as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, feature prominent peaks like Lonely Mountain and Mount Doom. I just couldn't resist doing something similar. Most of the action of Mountain Folk occurs during the Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1781. In fact, the outbreak of war is one of the major themes of the book. The Revolutionary War was across much of America less a resistance to invasion than a civil war among people who had a great deal in common, but who disagreed strongly, even violently, about loyalty. Would they be loyal to their king or to their local traditions of self-government? Which should be the higher value, order or liberty? I'm standing in a state park that's located next to the site of one of those Revolutionary War battles, the Battle of Kings Mountain. At that battle, there was only one British regular named Patrick Ferguson. He was the commander of about 1,000 or so Tory militia, that is, Americans who remained loyal to the crown during the war. The Tories camped on top of Kings Mountain in October 1780. They found themselves surrounded by Patriot militia from the Carolinas, Virginia, Georgia, and modern-day Tennessee. Among the commanders of the Patriots was Isaac Shelby. He's one of the main characters in Mountain Folk. The battle lasted just over an hour, but it was decisive. Many Tories died. Some 700 Tories were taken prisoner. The Patriots suffered only a few dozen casualties. General Charles Cornwallis was the overall commander of the British forces in the area. At Kings Mountain, he lost an entire flank of his army. After several more months of rough and often bloody campaigning throughout the Carolinas, Cornwallis took his army to Virginia and eventually to Yorktown, where he surrendered near the end of 1781. Speaking of Yorktown, that's one of several other Revolutionary War battles that I depict in the pages of Mountain Folk. Some were open field battles, such as the 1777 Battle of Germantown, where George Washington's inventive attack plan might have worked, except for a thick fog that wafted over the battlefield and robbed his generals of command and control. Other battles in the war were more like sieges, and they didn't always involve regular troops fighting other regular troops. For example, at Boonesboro, in what's now Kentucky, Daniel Boone and his fellow settlers were besieged by hundreds of Shawnee warriors who'd been armed and encouraged to attack by the British. A few militiamen from Canada were even among those attackers. Yet another kind of battle is an amphibious attack from the sea. In Mountain Folk, I depict the British attack on Charleston in 1776, which involved both a naval bombardment and an attempted British landing on Sullivan's Island. That battle actually made the palmetto tree the state symbol of South Carolina. That beast on the cover of my book is no ordinary mountain lion. It's a wampus cat, a magical monster right out of traditional Appalachian folklore. Actually, for my version of the monster, I also mixed in features from another Carolina cryptid called the Beast of Bladenboro. Back in the 1950s, it reportedly terrorized the community of Bladenboro by killing several animals and drinking their blood. I just used the word cryptid, but I guess you might not know what that is. A cryptid is a creature that is known by rumor or legend, even though it's not been proven to exist. I suppose the most familiar example would be the Loch Ness Monster, or Bigfoot. As it happens, I'm speaking to you from the Cryptozoology and Paranormal Museum in Littleton, North Carolina. It studies and exhibits information about Bigfoot, lake monsters, and all sorts of other legendary creatures. I spend a lot of time researching cryptids to populate my novel Mountain Folk with scary monsters. I pulled some of them straight out of American folklore, such as the famous Jersey Devil, which has the head and body of an elk and the wings of a bat. In other cases, I introduced monsters that originated in Europe, often in connection with immigrants traveling over the sea to America. A Tetzel worm, for example, comes from the folklore of the Alps. It has the head and forelegs of a giant cat and the body of a snake. Native American folklore was also a major source for my book. The thunderbird is revered in many Indian cultures. The Cherokee version, called a Tlanoa, is said to be eternally at war with the Uktana, a great horned serpent. In Mountain Folk, monsters aren't just obstacles for my characters to overcome. They're central to the plot. Fairy nations send out rangers from their magic realms to locate the monsters, and then they deploy entire hunting parties of archers and spearmen to capture or kill the beasts. Keep in mind that many people in early America believed that fairies, witchcraft, and monsters were very real. That fact might make you smile, but it ought not to make you feel too smug. After all, monster hunting is still a thing today. Entire TV channels seem devoted to chasing cryptids and stalking ghosts. And don't you know some people who check their horoscopes, get their palms read, or even consult psychics? The book takes place in early America from 1751 to 1791. It's part historical fiction, part fantasy fiction. Some of the characters and events are based on fact, others on folklore. To make this combination work, I try to give enough historical detail that even my fantastical story sounds like it might have actually happened during the period of the American Revolution. Now, some of those historical details have to do with how people lived, or more to the point, where they lived. For example, some of the action of Mountain Folk occurs at a famous residence you can still visit today, Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. During the latter stage of the Revolutionary War, Jefferson served as governor of Virginia. The British tried to capture him, first at the Capitol in Richmond and later at Monticello itself. While Jefferson was entertaining Virginia legislators at his home, a young man named Jack Jewett arrived at Monticello in the middle of the night to warn him that the British were coming. Yes, that phrase ought to sound familiar. Jack Jewett's legendary ride, which I depict in Mountain Folk, was a bit like the famous ride of Paul Revere, though in my version, of course, there's a bit of magic involved too. Another historic home featured in Mountain Folk is Mount Vernon, the residence of George Washington. He's a significant character in the book, actually, from his exploits during the French and Indian War to his time as president. Right now I'm standing in front of Tryon Palace in New Bern, North Carolina. You can see the palace right over there. It was completed in 1770 as a residence for the royal governor at the time, William Tryon. Now, this palace makes an appearance in Mountain Folk as an example of the kind of extravagance that angered American taxpayers and turned them against British rule. Of course, the vast majority of Americans didn't live in mansions or palaces. Most of the human characters of Mountain Folk live in places like farmhouses and log cabins. Among the Cherokee, who play a big role in my story, their towns contained a variety of structures, such as open-air summer houses, snug winter homes, storehouses, and great council houses built with 7 sides so the leaders of each of the Cherokee's 7 clans could sit together during meetings. Daniel Boone is another important character in Mountain Folk. The frontier settlement he helped to found in modern-day Kentucky, called Boonesboro, was attacked by British Allied Indians in 1778. He and the other residents of Boonesboro defended their homes against overwhelming odds. That chapter of Mountain Folk is a personal favorite of mine. Mountain Folk begins with a 16-year-old Daniel Boone and his family traveling south from Pennsylvania to find a new home in North Carolina. Daniel meets a flying fairy named Gorin, and together they confront a terrifying wampus cat. That never happened, of course, but even as a youth, Daniel Boone was one of the best rifle shots on the frontier. He would later spend years at a time on hunting and trapping expeditions in the mountains of the Carolinas, Virginia, and what are now Tennessee and Kentucky. Here's something else about Daniel Boone you may find surprising. He liked to read. Other than the Bible, his favorite book was Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Boone read Gulliver's Travels over and over again. It helped him pass the time during those long, lonely hunting trips. Now, my novel Mountain Folk is a historical fantasy. You see both human characters like Daniel Boone and magical ones like Gorin. But only a few humans have what I call the sight, with a capital S, that is, the ability to see fairies. And in Mountain Folk, those few humans just happen to enjoy books with magical or fantastic elements like Gulliver's Travels. I'm speaking to you from historic Bath, North Carolina, just located on the Pamlico River. It's the oldest town in my home state. Behind me is the Palmer Marsh House, built in 1744. It's one of the oldest homes in North Carolina. Many people associate Bath with perhaps its most famous resident, Blackbeard the Pirate. But here's a lesser-known fact. One of America's first community libraries was born right here. Wealthy American families had small book collections of their own, of course, but I'm talking about a library to which people in the community might pay a membership fee for access to a common store of books. A few of these books may have been published in America, typically by printers, such as Benjamin Franklin, who also published official government documents as well as newspapers and almanacs. But during the period my novel takes place, which is the latter half of the 1700s, the books most Americans read were printed in England or elsewhere in Europe. Thomas Jefferson, another important character in Mountain Folk, was an avid book collector. By the year 1814, Jefferson owned the largest personal library in the United States. 1814 was the year a British army raided Washington and, among other things, burned the Library of Congress. So Jefferson sold his books at a huge discount to create the new Library of Congress. Jefferson immediately set out to build a new book collection. I can relate. I love both reading and writing books. Mountain Folk is in fact the 8th book I've written, though it is my first novel. I sure hope my readers enjoy reading it. In fact, I hope the final chapter leaves them wanting to read more adventures of Gorin and his friends. Forest Folk, the next book in my folklore cycle, will come out next year. Daniel Boone was one of America's first folk heroes. He lived an amazing life, but as later writers retold and embellished Boone's adventures, he became more than a man. He became a legend. I'm speaking to you from Davidson County, North Carolina. Legend has it that when Daniel Boone and his family first arrived in North Carolina from Pennsylvania, they spent the better part of their first winter here in this area, sheltered from the elements and from any enemies in this small cave. Did something like that really happen? Maybe. It is true that the Boone family and their friends built homes not far from here on the Yadkin River. By the way, I can put one myth to rest. Contrary to many portrayals, Daniel Boone did not wear a coonskin cap. He hated them. Another character in Mountain Folk that fits the definition of a folk hero is Peter Muhlenberg. He was a Lutheran minister in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia who became one of George Washington's generals during the Revolutionary War. The legend of Peter Muhlenberg centers on the last sermon he preached before marching off to war. Quoting the book of Ecclesiastes, Peter says, "There is a time to be born and a time to die, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time of war and a time of peace. As for me," Peter says, "there is a time to preach, but that time has passed away. The time to fight has now come." Then Peter Muhlenberg throws off his black clerical robes to reveal his Continental Army uniform. Again, I can't say for certain that this bit of folklore is based on hard historical fact, but it certainly is a dramatic moment, a moment that has inspired many poets and writers and artists. I couldn't help but include this scene in my novel Mountain Folk. Another important folk hero of early America was a Cherokee woman named Nancy Ward, or Nanyehi in the language of her people. In her youth, Nanyehi led a Cherokee war party to victory after her husband was killed right before her eyes. In later life, however, she became a legendary peacemaker. Since then, the story of Nanyehi has been retold in prose, verse, and even a musical play. I was delighted and honored to make her a key character in my novel. There's a great deal of magic, myth, and folklore in this novel, Mountain Folk, but the story itself is deeply rooted in historical fact. One of those facts is that seemingly small events can shape the course of history. A snap decision at a critical moment, a quirky accident, an unexpected discovery, a sudden twist of fate. There's an entire genre of fiction called alternative history that picks up this idea and runs with it. It asks readers to imagine what would have happened if, say, Julius Caesar hadn't been assassinated, or the South had won the Civil War, or if computing devices had been invented in the 19th century rather than the 20th century. The results of this work can be entertaining, it can be enlightening, but my novel, Mountain Folk, isn't strictly speaking alternative history. I'm not rewriting the outcomes of historical events. What I'm doing is offering alternative explanations of how those events might have happened. Behind me is a reconstruction of Fort Dobbs. It was built on the Carolina frontier during the French and Indian War. Its original intention was to serve as a refuge and a defense against attacks by French allied Indian tribes such as the Shawnee. But other events produced a different outcome. You might say, a twist of fate. When the British captured modern-day Pittsburgh in 1758, they were assisted not only by American troops, but by warriors of the Cherokee Nation. After the Cherokees were denied provisions for their journey home, they took some horses that they felt they'd earned, but the Americans considered them thieves. So tensions escalated to all-out war. In early 1760, the Cherokees attacked all along the frontier. They also attacked Fort Dobbs. They made off with some horses, but they failed to take the fort. The war brought terrible suffering for the Cherokee, and it sowed the seeds of even more suffering in the future. In Mountain Folk, I depict several other twists of fate. A dense fog turns possible victory into bitter defeat. Thomas Jefferson barely escapes capture by a British army, and because of bungled orders, some of George Washington's best fighters never show up for his biggest battle. In each case, while I don't alter the basic historical facts, I let my human characters, my fairy characters, and even some monstrous beasts take actions that determine the course of history. It's all in good fun, of course, but it's also my way of underlining just how contingent history can be. If you write a novel set in America during the 1700s, it won't be true to life unless religious faith plays a significant role. Many Americans at this time had deep religious convictions that guided the way they thought and acted. I'm standing in front of St. Thomas Episcopal Church in Bath, North Carolina. It was built in 1734. It's the oldest surviving church building in my home state, and in fact it's one of the oldest churches in America. When you study the history of frontier settlements across colonial America, from New England and the backcountry of Pennsylvania down to Georgia, the role of faith and religious descent is impossible to miss. Many of my own ancestors, for example, were originally Anglicans, Puritans, or Dutch Reformed church members who moved west and south. They often became Quakers or Presbyterians along the way, and then they joined Baptist or Methodist churches when they got to the Carolinas. In my novel, many of the characters profess their faith, pray for God's guidance, or give thanks to divine providence for shepherding America past perils and pitfalls. One of the main characters, Peter Muhlenberg, is himself a Lutheran minister. Peter's father, Henry Muhlenberg, was basically the founder of the Lutheran Church in America. In the early 1770s, he sent Peter to the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia to pastor a congregation of German-speaking settlers. In Mountain Folk, I depict Peter Muhlenberg hiking into the wilderness shortly after his arrival, praying for inspiration. He looks up at a mountain, and he recalls the words of the prophet Isaiah, "And there shall be a tabernacle for a shadow in the daytime from the heat, and for a place of refuge." When this Bible verse comes to mind, Peter interprets that as a sign from God. He resolves to make the mountain and his church a refuge for the faithful. Much later, as an army general, Peter attends a meeting just before the Battle of Yorktown, where George Washington credits divine providence, and the French general Rochambeau credits their own efforts for laying the trap the British are about to step into. "Gentlemen," Peter reminds them, "if I may quote the book of Proverbs, a man's heart deviseth his way, but the Lord directeth his steps. We have both divine guidance and human ingenuity to thank for our present position. That's how a minister turned general would talk, isn't it? You can always learn more about my novel by visiting the book's website, which is simply mountainfolkbook.com. While there, you can learn how to order the book. Thanks for watching.